Welcome, everybody.
Cool.
It is once again one of our interviews here on, well, either YouTube, Spotify, wherever you watch it, but it's Veil of Sound Interview. And I'm very, very happy to have a person here with me who was able to blast my friend Dan from Mastiff's Album of the Year list by releasing an album on November 11th, of which Dan says, screw it, it's going to be top 5, I'm sure.
That's great.
I'm very happy to have Kyle Bates from Drowse here on the show. Kyle, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Something that I ask everyone on this show. Are you wearing some kind of band merch at the moment that you want to pluck or not?
I just have a black shirt button up, but if I can plug a few friends really quickly, one would be my friend Lula Asplund, who sings on the album. They make really amazing experimental music under their own name. And then my friend Taylor does a project called Being Alone, and he also plays on a lot of Drowse recordings, and I think is super underappreciated, kind of indie rock, but very strange sounds and dense layers of sound. So good. So I'll plug both of them, but I wish I had their t-shirt.
No problem. I, of course, also have to plug something. Probably the best post-rock band to ever come out of my hometown of Cologne, Norvik. If anybody hasn't listened to their last album, Hephaistos, you could find a review on our page. And believe me when I say the Feast is the best post-rock track of the year. So you should check that one out as well. Second question, of course, where are we catching you right now, Kyle?
Oh, so right now I'm in LA, or right kind of in the mountains outside of LA.
So you're living in the Hollywood Hills?
No, not the hills. More like the outskirts. It's like the desert.
Yeah.
I wish I was that fancy, but no, I'm up here in the middle of nowhere. It's really beautiful out here, though.
Yeah, that's usually the thing with the middle of nowhere, right? It's always very beautiful, and it's also very beautiful because not a lot of people live there.
Yeah, and very quiet.
Yes. When doing my research, I looked at your Bandcamp page, and I found, and also at the Spotify description that you gave, or that you wrote about yourself and the project. That was something that really struck me, because it totally took me back to university, where I had some professors who, in English, made us read French philosophers of the 20th century. And I always thought, like, why do I have to read that? Until I got into it and really loved the stuff that they wrote and came up with. And you, in your Spotify description, you say that Drowse is influenced by Roland Barthes' reading of self as text. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so I studied English in my undergrad degree. And so I read a lot of this like literary criticism philosophy. And Barthes is like my favorite, partially just because I think he's the best writer, like aesthetically, or one of the best writers in terms of actually being poetic and like reading things that I enjoy reading, versus a lot of philosophy is very dry, you know? But this idea of reading the self as text is interesting to me, because it's like he has a book called Barthes on Barthes.
Yeah.
Where he takes his own life.
Ones.
Yeah. He takes his own life and he's like analyzing it as if it's like, reading through a literary text and kind of deconstructing everything.
Yeah.
And so
he's
that
also taking himself apart, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But like kind of from this detached way, you know? And so that's like, sometimes when I'm writing lyrics or thinking about my own life, I try to take on this hat of Barthes, in that book. Like try to approach my past experiences or memories and like really look at them through what if this was another person? What would I think? Or if this was a story that I was reading. So I think that's why I cited him. I also just really enjoy a lot of his thinking in other ways.
When we are talking about Barthes and reading a person's history and self as text, then of course the question arises in the 21st century, something that he could not have seen. Do you think it's possible to rewrite that text and also that notion of self, like recoding one's persona and maybe even adding also some kind of prequel to that present.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that we all kind of do that by using the internet. You know, social media is like this act of like rewriting yourself, or at least editing, you know?
Yeah.
And that's something that I'm really interested too, and like is thinking about memory and the way that we're constantly rewriting it in our own brain. Like every time we remember something, it's a memory of the previous memory, right? So we're already doing that unconsciously, but then we're also, I think, picking and choosing these sections that we want to remember and highlighting them.
Definitely.
So to me, the past is kind of a fiction that is like creating or influencing the present and kind of reconstructing it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It totally does. I mean, like being a history teacher, we all know what Santayana said about it, and we also all know, that if you don't learn from history, you are condemned to repeat it. But we also all know that history is a narrative, and that narrative is determined by a few people. If anybody of us, and I don't know if you did, but if you ever read, for example, I think it's Thomas Harris, not Robert Harris. One of the two.
Yeah, I'm not familiar.
Who wrote Fatherland, where you totally are transported in the alternate 1964, where the Germans won World War II. And all of a sudden you see that whole narrative would have been changed. And also because, of course, some things would not have gotten public. And of course, when you can edit out things and blur them, and that is definitely true. And I like your comparison with the internet. Social media is definitely just that. So let me ask you, how interested and how involved are you in the idea and usage of modern life, virtual reality, or also something like the hypertext?
Yeah. I mean, it's just something that kind of disturbs me and that we all partake in, right? And I guess one thing that I am interested is like this idea of hyperreality, like Baudrillard, and the simulation and the virtual. But I'm more interested in that in terms of recording sound and the way that that's applied to my recordings, because when we listen to a rock record, we're hearing a microphone that's right up to the speaker, and our ears don't actually work this way, but we accept it as reality when we hear the record played back, even though that's actually a simulated way of listening to music. So I guess most of the, when I think about this philosophy stuff, I'm trying to think of it in terms of how does this apply to the sounds that I'm making or other sound or music artists that I'm interested in.
Does your knowledge of philosophy and modern philosophy also in some ways help you understand modern life more easily?
I don't know if it helps. I think it just complicates it more, right? Yeah, I don't know. So I also was reading a lot of Deleuze when I was working on this record, and like really trying to get into it, but it's very difficult. But he has the idea of like the virtual that you mentioned, which is the idea that, okay, so we have the real, like this event of us talking, but then we also have all of our thoughts that are happening now, which are they're actual things. They're things that are happening, but they're maybe ideas or thoughts or notions that we can't put a concrete agreed upon reality. And so that's really interesting to me, because I've always felt that, I guess in my life, like dreams or thoughts or whatever feel as impactful sometimes as lived experiences. And so I guess this is a long tangent way of answering your question, but like reading something like Deleuze and reading about the virtual, it actually confuses me more. But I love to think about this stuff.
You also definitely love to think about music, because that is very obvious when listening to your records, also the new one. let's, before we go into Wane Into It and into everything that is related to that, let me ask you, has there been some kind of like gateway band or record or event or TV show or whatever that got you into making music? Not just listening to music, but making music.
Yeah, so maybe I could name 3 really quick touchstones.
Of course.
Like with listening, I will go back to that. I think like maybe 2nd grade or something. My cousin was showing me Metallica, and that was very scary, but you know, huge influence for just getting into music. And I always used listening to music with headphones as kind of a way of like blocking out the world or problems or whatever. Or if I was shy, you know, I always wore headphones to kind of, and I used a lot of metal music when I was growing up to do this, I think, just because it feels like a blanket or so loud. But yeah, for making music with drowse particularly, I think one concert that was really influential was Mount Erie opening for Mogwai, which I saw in high school, which was like really mind-blowing and just beautiful, and that kind of pushed me down a path of like the kind of music that I wanted to write with this project. Another one was hearing artists like Tim Hecker or One Oh Tricks Point Never, more like experimental electronic artists. They had records coming out like right when I started using Ableton and started to record, and they really made me think about sound as like a material that you can stretch and change, and it doesn't have to be just the sound of the guitar, you know. So that's a long answer, but there's a few touch points. I think
that's totally fine, because it basically leads me to my next question. When listening to you list the artists, Metallica, Mount Erie, also of course Mogwai, which you have attended, Tim Hecker, that are a lot of different genres, right? And when listening to, for example, Wane Into It, also to the other records by Drowse, I always have the feeling as if, I mean, like we could call it indie, right? Because it's just too vast for anything else. But on the same hand, there is one label that I think would apply perfectly. And I don't know if you ever used Winamp back in the day. Winamp was one of those, it was one of those, you know, before we had streaming, we had like programs like Winamp to play our music on computers. And the cool thing about Winamp had, you could categorize the stuff. And I still remember one of them was Primus as a label, and the other was Zappa. I would come up with a third one, and that would be the Flenser. Do you think that the sound of that label is maybe the only way of really trying to tell people what you're doing without listing 25 genres?
Yeah, I think like I could see what you're getting at with that. And I think it's kind of a yes and no, because on the one hand, I don't think my music sounds like Chat Pile or, you know, Elizabeth Color Wheelers. You know, they're all the artists are so different on this label. But I do think it works because like one thing that's consistent is that every artist is kind of uncategorizable, but also dark maybe. And that most of them experiment or like you said, like mixed genres and stuff. And yeah, on the subject of genre, I always kind of resist trying to get lumped into one, because that's not how I write music. You know, I don't think about, oh, I'm gonna make like a shoegaze song now and I'm gonna try to make this or whatever. When I write songs, I'm just writing and listening and following what comes out. And I actually think it's a little bit I don't understand why people create new bands with one genre in mind, you know, when we have like so much golden music and like most of the very defined genres. So I think the Flenser is great. They really work with a lot of bands that try to push past those constraints.
Definitely. And I'm still always telling my friend Walter at Roadburn that we need a Flenser showcase every year, because, you know, just like you say, they put out amazing records every year, and every year there are like 2 or 3 bands that one would not have seen on the Flenser before. By the way, would you agree that the Flenser is probably the best fitting label for drowse?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in terms of like the thing that I really like about working with this label is that I've been able to make a lot of friends through it and like have a ton of really instant kind of common interests. For instance, Tom from Planning for Burial and I have been friends for like almost 10 years, I think, just talking about music and stuff. And we're both like specifically nerdy in the same areas, if that makes sense, about music. And a lot of other artists on this label are like that, where they're very easy to connect with, because everybody's like a big fan of music too, or about particular types of music. And yeah, I don't know if it's the only label I could work with, but I think it's a good fit.
Are there other labels outside of the Flenser that you follow on a very regular or maybe constant basis?
I mean, some of my favorites ever are like Cranky Records. And I think that label's amazing because they have, I don't know, such a consistent aesthetic and sound, even though, you listen to Grouper or Belong or Tim Hecker and they're all like totally different, but at the same time, similar to the Flenser, it's very well curated and I can really trust them. 4AD, of course, is another one that, through history has been, there's some weird stuff that I don't like, but, a lot of my favorite bands have worked with that label. And then actually I have a friend in Seattle named Elliot who runs a tape label called Drongo Tapes, who has just also consistently put out a lot of good stuff in the past few years. Yeah, I love it when a label's like actually curating something. It feels like an art project more than we need to put this and this to make money.
Yeah, when it's more than just making money, right? Having some kind of even artistic vision, right? What also, of course, strikes everybody who listens to drowse, unless they're deaf and dumb and blind, is the fact that sound is a very, very important element for drowse. Is that also one of the reasons why sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, there are tiny bit of bigger pauses between your releases?
Yeah, especially this record, I think.
Yeah.
And then the one Cold Air, the first one for the Flenser, was like a very long time after other things as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's part of it. I think with this record, I was really trying to pay attention to all the small details with sound. And I also record everything by myself. So I put a lot of effort into becoming a better engineer too. So there's, I think, extra time in that because I'm not just writing the music, it's also learning and, trying to get new skills and collecting new microphones and, setting up the conditions I need to make it sound the way that I want. But also this record took longer because I finished my master's degree while I was working on it as well. So there was a lot of energy going into that at the same time as trying to work on the music.
How much of creating drowse songs, how much of that is trial and error?
Yeah, a lot of trial and error. But I think it's created in a different way than like a typical band, where you're in a practice room and you're playing together and that's all a lot of trial and error jamming and stuff. For me, it's more like I'm writing things on the guitar or have a piano or whatever, a bassist. But then a lot of it is just me interacting with my computer and with my recording software and just trying things out and taking different sounds and stretching them or running them through a distortion or, there's a lot of that process too until it feels right.
Let me ask you one question because as I said, I looked at Bandcamp pages, other stuff. But when I looked at the Bandcamp page for the new record, it was like an ever growing list of collaborations and who did what. And I have to ask that, is it true that you built some of the instruments for Wane Into It? Like your own glockenspiel?
Yeah. I built a glockenspiel from just different materials and things.
Hmm.
With actually this guy Daniel Schmidt who works on gamelan instruments, he
Hmm.
helped me with it. He has a metal workshop, and he kind of guided me through this process. But
Okay.
yeah, I built that, and then I also use like contact mics, and
Hmm.
put them on different objects and hit them or whatever, getting weird sounds. So I also build instruments in that way too, I think.
It's a pretty industrial approach to music, isn't it?
Yeah. It's actually like industrial. I do really like I love throbbing gristle, but
Okay.
but I would say it's more influenced by like musique concrète and getting
Hmm.
some sounds out of the world that aren't, typically thought of as musical, and then
Hmm. Hmm.
warping them. And
Yeah,
yeah,
being German, one of the bands that always comes to my mind in that context are Einstürzende Neubauten, because they built every instrument that they used in the 80s for their records. But their sound,
yeah.
of course, is completely different. But are you interested, apart from Robin Gristle, are you interested in this like industrial phase of the 80s?
A little bit, but it's not like my main interest.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I guess like some of the bands that I kind of associate, but I don't know if you could categorize it with, are like Coil. Also,
Hmm.
is a band that like is a big influence and I really love. Um, and then I also, of course, like the '90s industrial. Like Nine Inch Nails is like a big band for me growing up. So he also uses a lot of these practices, but
Yeah.
kind of taking them in this pop direction. Um, but yeah, I have some interest. I wouldn't say that's like the biggest inspiration for drowse, but I'm more interested in that process because it's a way to create new sounds that other people don't
That's
use.
exactly what I
Yeah,
associated with it, because, of course, your music is very, very lush. It's very, very gentle on the ear, to put it in
hmm
a maybe too nice way of saying it, because you also have some very intense moments when it also becomes louder. Um, but your music is never aggressive in a way, at least to somebody who, like me, listens to a lot of black metal and death metal. So,
yeah,
um, but um, it's a very soft carpet of sounds that you are creating, and um, for example, the very first song on the record is a little different, because
hmm
that actually is like hard hitting for your
yeah. It has
standard.
a distorted riff on it. Yeah.
Was that intentional to open with that one?
Yeah, I think the sequencing wise, yes, I wanted to have something that kind of forced people to listen really quickly.
Yeah.
But also, like you mentioned, black metal, that is a huge influence for me too. And that was like growing up, I was very obsessed with black metal. You don't hear it much in the music, but like
Not at
to me,
all.
yeah, the quality though of like something like Paysage d'Hiver or something where there's like a
Oh,
big cloud of sound, right?
yeah,
This
yeah.
quality is similar to me with what I make, where there's
Mm,
these layers and it's like almost a blanket or something.
mm,
Or Olver,
mm,
for instance, their first record is
mm.
very massive sounding. So yeah, more about that process of getting this big sound out of something than the actual riffs of black metal.
But then I have to ask, because a lot of black metal sounds the way it sounds because it's
Yeah,
very lo-fi,
yeah,
and lo-fi in a sense that it doesn't use a lot of tracks. With
yeah,
drowse, it's the total opposite, because I guess when looking at the list of instruments that you're using, I
yeah,
assume that on some songs we probably have like 16, 18, 20 tracks.
yeah. I guess I don't mean exactly in the construction of it, how many
Mm-hmm.
tracks or how it's recorded, but more
Mm-hmm.
in creating an atmosphere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Okay.
a lot of black metal instantly puts you into like this, a sense of place or something, a cold winter. And so
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
do, not
Yeah.
exactly technically or with the sound, but
Yeah. Yeah.
this idea of creating this atmosphere and environment or something with the music. So
Well,
that's how,
then Passage d'Hiver is certainly one of the go-to for things for that, because of course,
yeah.
yeah, definitely. You might want to check the Eisenton Eisentone label from Eastern Germany. They have a lot going that direction if you haven't already heard of that, but that is definitely one that could benefit your likings. And what I also like, just like everybody else who I've been talking to over the last couple of days, everybody says like, oh yeah, he's such a great musician, and the visualizations that he always has are so cool. You are a visual artist as well as a musician, aren't you?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I started working with video stuff maybe 6 or 7 years ago, so it's more recent for me. But I do mostly all the music videos for Drowse. And I also do like sound and video installation artwork, but not mostly under my own name, you know? So yeah, I think the sound and music's my primary thing, but that's my another interest, you know?
When we look at the songs that you wrote for Wane Into It, you've already mentioned this record took more time. I think the last songs you released was in 2019 or 2020. Took some more time because of you finishing your master's degree. But did the pandemic also play into that you needed more time?
Honestly, like I don't think it played into the time. Maybe in some ways because I was probably like most people using a lot of escapism, like, you know, films and books and games and whatever, and kind of going into my own world that way. But I think the pandemic actually had more of an impact on, you mentioned there's a lot of collaborators on the record and different musicians playing.
Yeah.
And that was partially, I think, because of the pandemic, because I was very, you know, isolated, living in one house with one other person. And so it made me want to reach out more and say, hey, can I send you this track? We can talk and maybe you can play a violin on this part or something. So I think that was more of a result. It made me more, you know, seeking other people to work with.
Yeah, and then of course, you know, if you send out stuff to other people and ask them to collaborate, that means that you also again have to wait more. Yeah, that makes
that's
sense.
also time consuming too.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but you lived in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest when you wrote this, or did you already live in Los Angeles?
Oh, so yeah, this is a bit confusing, but I actually lived in the Bay Area mostly when I was writing this. My family is from Portland, and that's where I've lived most of my life in the Pacific Northwest. But yeah, I was doing my degree at Mills College in Oakland, so I was mostly living there, but I was always recording, you know, going back home, recording in Portland, going here, just having my laptop microphone, bringing it around and, you know, working on it everywhere. Yeah, but I would consider the Pacific Northwest like my home base. And the only reason I'm in California now is because I'm finishing a doctorate degree right now. So, but that area is a very big influence for me on my sound and the visual aspect of this music.
Can you explain the latter thing a little bit? You know, like in which way does it influence your sound?
Yeah, so one thing is that it's always overcast. You know, clouds all the time, rain all the time, super dark. And I think everyone that I know who grew up there has like a little bit of a more darker, dreary disposition, you know, a kind of a bit quieter. And I think this definitely just influences my general outlook. And I think when you hear the music, you can hear this kind of atmosphere or environment. But also the artists, like a lot of my favorite artists are from up there. Like I said, Mount Erie, Grouper, or the band Unwound is another example of like, you can see this thread, or Wolves in the Throne Room even. I think when I was growing up, they were releasing albums, you know, when I was in high school. All these bands have some sort of sound that to me is connected to this area. You know, if you think about
the gloom, right?
The gloom. And you can hear it in the music, and I think that's, for me, it's just, you know, I spent so many years there, maybe that came inside too.
Maybe also somebody like my friend ALN from Mismo.
Yeah. Yeah, Meesmore's a good one, and actually is from Salem, I think, right? So very close to where I grew up.
I
Yeah.
think it's Salem. Yeah. Yeah, but definitely Oregon and more to the west of it. Yeah, that's true. What is very interesting, you say that the music of Drowse, or at least you hinted at it, the music of Drowse it has some kind of dark side to it. Definitely. It's not the funky chicken, right? But it's also in no way at all bleak or suicidal or negative. I feel as if there is always at least one strong ray of hope in there. Just my imagination, or is it also something that is true for you when writing it?
Yeah, actually for this record, I have a few friends who told me this too. They said, "Oh, this one sounds more hopeful somehow." Which is strange because I wasn't thinking about that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, that's true. I don't think I'm setting out to make, you know, DSBM or so, like, you know, something that's just wallowing in a suicidal point of view. Like a lot of my music comes out of me having had struggles with these things. You know, when I was younger, I tried to commit suicide, and I have had a lot of mental health struggles, you know, over time. And so I don't think I'm trying to speak to like give this negative thing. I think mostly it's me trying to like stumble around the world and my thoughts and navigate how to be a human while living with these things. And I think that's positive because a lot of the art I like also does this, where if I can see someone else maybe struggling but being open about it, that is a relatable thing that can push me forward or help me figure out, you know, the other ways that I could live or think or approach sadness, I guess, or dealing with these things. So I think it is, yeah, it's a hopeful thing. If that.
You've mentioned your mental struggles, and you are very open about them, which is a very cool thing in the way that one shouldn't hide those things, right? Let's put it like that. And before we recorded this, you already mentioned that you have been diagnosed with being bipolar. Do you think that the music also, in a way, helps you to keep, for lack of a better word, a sane mind?
Yeah, so this is something that I think is a complicated question, right? Because as I mentioned with the philosophy stuff earlier, there's like a lot of sometimes reading and thinking
There's
about
a
things
lot of
can
yes
just
and a lot of no, right?
a lot of both. Yeah, it makes things more complex. So like, yes, when I'm working on this music, it's a way for me to like almost diaristically or journalistically like explore the way that my brain's working, and that can help, you know, externalize feelings, of course. But at the same time, sometimes I wonder, okay, I'm dedicating this whole album to, for instance, Light Mirror. My last album was a lot about self-isolation. And in the process of making that record, I really self-isolated to make it. And that ended up having a bad effect on different relationships and things in my life. You know, so it's like sometimes I feel like this music can also be spending so much time self-analyzing or thinking about negative things that maybe it could be unhealthy. And I think this new record, no, I wasn't. I was consciously trying not to get into that mindset, but in the past, it has had a tendency to take over. And like you said, I'm bipolar, so that's something I have to watch out for. Like mania gets triggered from obsession. You know, this when you're getting or focusing really hard on something, it can spiral into a detachment from reality. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, you know.
Can it also, in the worst moments, spiral into despair because you don't get it done the way you want to get it done?
Yeah, I guess in a way, although I don't know. I feel like I've become very perfectionist and narrow focused when I'm working on stuff. And at least the past couple records, really were like what they turned out the way that I wanted them to. You know, I think the first one, Cold Air, I did feel like that, like a little bit like, oh, I can't express it. I'm not good enough at recording, or I'm not good enough at this skill or this thing, and it's not the way that I wanted, but okay, I have to finish this. And so that's, I think, part of why this one took longer too, is I really wanted to intentionally like hone the craft and avoid that feeling, you know.
So how happy are you with Wane Into It?
I'm really happy with this one. Like I feel like the last record a bit, but like I said, there was so much negativity surrounding the making of it that it was hard to feel good. But with Wane Into It, yeah, it really feels like this is a realization of the vision that I was actually trying to do. I don't have a lot of regrets with the sound or anything. Like always there's things that let's do a nitpick, but
Yeah.
I think it turned out really good. And also while I was making this record, I think I was a lot healthier in my own personal life. So in that way, it just feels better. Like it feels like it was a better experience to make this record. Yeah.
It's interesting that you say it was a better experience making this record when you made it in the middle of one of the worst pandemics of all times.
Yeah,
But
I guess I just mean in my relationship with the art, not exactly with the rest of the world.
Let me explain it. It sounds like a very positive kind of escapism, which is totally, which in itself, one has to admit, you know, if anybody in these troubling times found a positive way to get out of the mental distress, then that way is perfect for him or her, and then that is one of the most wonderful things I can imagine. Let's get a little bit into you writing the songs for Wane Into It. How must we imagine the writing process for the tracks? You know, I'm not talking about where you find your inspiration, because that is very, 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 very difficult. But what is the starting point? Is there like a certain instrument with which you always start, or do you first build a beat, or do you first go for the sound? How must we imagine that?
Yeah, 1 second. I'll grab a guitar to show really quick.
Wonderful. So everybody, on stage performance, that's like the best thing, and we've never had it in our time here on Veil of Sound. That's what we love about it, right? Don't we?
I missed what you said because
I just said how wonderful it is to have an on-stage performance, so to speak.
Well, I'm not going to play. I just wanted to show this guitar is, you know, very beautiful sounding guitar that I usually write most of my songs initially on that acoustic. That one belonged to my dad when he was growing up, and he gave it to me. So yeah, that's on every record. And a lot of the songwriting starts there, just making the skeleton on the guitar. And then often you don't hear any acoustic guitar, but I usually record it and then strip it away and start adding things. And that just creates the map, you know?
Sometimes one hears it's way in the back of the mix, right?
Yeah. So there's either that or a few songs. Sometimes, like I said, I like to build sounds from field recordings. And so sometimes it will start that way, like with taking a recording that I've made, putting it into Ableton and chopping it and making something, and then it grows. But I'd say often that guitar is the start.
Fun story, a band that you probably know just like I do, Unsane from New York.
Yeah, great band.
I still remember when Chris a few weeks ago told me that one of the reasons why the first records, or especially the first two, might sound so haunting was because he basically really went through the streets of New York City doing field recordings and then placing like layers and layers and layers over noise over them. But he said, you could still feel the haunt. And that's, I think, something that field recordings can do, you know, even if you don't hear them consciously, they still can create this mood, right?
Yeah, of course.
We've already mentioned it, I think once or twice, that you had a lot of collaborations on the new record. And one that I, of course, have to ask because I'm a huge fan. I guess getting Midwife, getting Madeline to play on the record was not a hard thing. Because I guess that is one of those people that you hinted at when you were talking about the Flenser, people that are like-minded. But first of all, how do you go about that? Do you say like, oh, hey, Madeline, I would like you to write something for this, or like, oh, I would like you to sing this or that passage, or is there like a pattern, or is it always very individual?
I think it's always different depending on who I'm working with, because sometimes I work with players that I just want them to play a part on an instrument that I don't know how to play, a violin or something. But with Madeline, that was very collaborative. I had that song Untrue in Headphones, the one that she's on. That was like kind of finished, but I was listening, it just felt very incomplete. Like I had put everything that I could do into it. And it was like, oh, this is missing something. And then I'm not sure why specifically I asked her. I just really love Midwife, and she's on the same label, so I knew this is someone I could contact who I knew would have a very different sounding voice than my own, to kind of counteract or maybe add something. So first I asked her if she would add the voice, and then I gave her my lyrics that I had written. So that was a bit less collaborative, maybe. But I said, write any melody, any harmony you want. And then I also asked her, like, I just told her, okay, you can also add other tracks, do whatever. So she ended up adding some distorted guitar as well. And she has a very signature sound with this too. And that combined with the way that her vocal harmonies sound, like, completely made that track good or finished feeling, But it was very much just me giving her kind of permission, do whatever you need, send me the tracks back and I'll mix it in there. And then
sometimes her guitar is very, very austere, very brittle, right?
Yeah.
True. One last question before we come to our quickfire round, which you have to go through like anybody else on this one. And that is a question that I know might sound stupid at first, but we've already been talking about life in the 21st century. How happy are you to live in this day and age? Because I'll explain myself. Because we both know that 120 years, 220 years ago, life would have been much harder for you with mental health issues and everything that goes along with it. So how happy are you that you're living in this day and age?
Yeah, that's a hard one, because there's like, of course, I'm happy with the mental health things. Like, I can get some medicine or therapy or whatever that I need to. That is, like, some necessities. Also, the internet, like we talked about, is a very, it produces a lot of anxiety, and I think in a lot of ways,
it's never yes and no thing, right?
Yeah. It's always this. Yeah, but then also, this is why people listen to my music. This is why we can talk now, and then I also,
it's interesting. Next time you come to Europe, we can also do a face-to-face.
I would prefer that for sure.
Me too.
Zoom is strange.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, I would love to meet. Okay, and then the other thing I wanted to say about that is, like, this is maybe dark, but I honestly think that, like, we're in kind of the fading days of humanity, or at least hopefully capitalism. For me, hopefully capitalism is fading, but it's more about, we've destroyed so much, and we're in this really strange place where I think everybody is feeling this anxiety of some sort of imminent collapse, and we keep seeing all these disastrous signs politically and environmentally, right? And so for me, that's very scary, but also, what a strange time to actually be born into, when the world is this actively changing, and maybe that's negative, but it's also very fascinating and fucked up to watch this stuff happening. I don't know.
There's not a day that goes by when my little daughter doesn't ask something where I first have to think like, how do I explain that?
Yeah.
And I still know if she had asked me 20 years ago, it would have been much easier. A lot, very, very different. So, Kyle, thanks for that. And now, up to the questions that I always love. I've already had bands fighting over this our interview. I'll always give you two alternatives, and you decide. For example, like roses versus tulips. Would you like more?
Yeah,
my wife would say tulips. I would say roses. Let's start off with something easy. Seattle versus San Francisco.
Yeah, I like the Pacific Northwest better, of course. But San Francisco is also beautiful, and it has this charm, and it's by the ocean, and you feel the mist of the air, and there's a lot of beautiful stuff there. So,
but it would be Seattle.
The West Coast of USA is great. It's
well,
awesome.
The northeastern part is also very nice.
Yeah, that's true.
But I know what you mean. It's the problem of urban centers versus rural areas, right?
Yeah.
We've been talking a little bit. We've been talking a little bit about, or you've already mentioned shoegaze. So I have to ask: slow dive versus lush.
Oh, that one I would say slow dive, of course, just because that was something that was for me a huge influence growing up. Lush I really appreciate, but I think My Bloody Valentine is better than both of them. For me,
yeah,
personally.
I was thinking about putting one of them up against My Bloody Valentine, but then I thought that sound-wise, there is too much of a difference. That's why I didn't.
Yeah, and MBV Loveless will beat any other shoegaze record.
Yeah, probably to a lot of us, right? Because it's just a perfect record from start to finish.
Yeah.
Shutter Island, the movie Shutter Island versus Inception.
Oh, Shutter Island for sure. I think Scorsese is a way better director, hands down. I mean, they're both okay, but Christopher Nolan is okay for me. But Martin Scorsese is like fantastic. Every film is pretty much.
Don't have to talk to me about that. My favorite director of all time, hands down.
Yeah,
there's no better. Throbbing Gristle versus Einstürzende Neubauten.
For me, Throbbing Gristle, I think just because I really like their origin story of not being musicians, being weird art school people, and just constructing these instruments, having these very strange I don't know, approach to music, and I like hearing them speak about it. But they're
completely
both
yeah, they are. I haven't seen Throbbing Gristle ever live, but I've seen Neubauten, and that's always huge. Very different, but at least similar names. Cave In versus Nick Cave.
Oh, that's hard because I really was into a lot of like this like Converge and Cave In and stuff when I was growing up. But I think Nick Cave has had a bigger effect on me in recent years, maybe past 10 years or something. Yeah.
I guess I know the answer to the next one, but synthesizers versus the guitar.
It's for me guitar, even though the synth, like I have back here a lot of strange synthesizers, and I love them, but the guitar is my first passion.
Vinyl versus streaming.
That's the obvious vinyl too. It's better to listen to a full record and have to pay attention to it, I think.
We've been talking about philosophy, and it's interesting that you mentioned one of the two alternatives I'm going to give you. Foucault or Deleuze?
Deleuze, but I like Foucault. That's someone that I'm not as deeply, like I need to spend more time with them. But yeah, Deleuze has been the current.
Yeah, I had a lot of time with Foucault, and I would still prefer Bart because he's easier to read.
Yeah, more
Put it
fun
like
to
that.
read.
Yeah, definitely. Decoding and deduction versus encoding and induction.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think decoding and deduction, and I like pulling things apart.
So you're more Sherlock Holmes than Moriarty.
Yeah, maybe.
Last one. You've also mentioned one of those. Filter versus 9-inch nails.
Yeah, I guess 9-inch nails. That's 13-year-old me would be loving it. And even right now I have Pretty Hate Machine in my car in the CD player. I was listening to it yesterday. So.
I think that we all agree on the fact that, let's say, the first 4 or 5 records are simply flawless, right? There is not one song on each of those records that is A, obsolete, B, superfluous, or B, not good anymore. It always holds up. Wonderful records.
Yeah, completely agree.
Kyle, thanks for this interview. Everybody, I always say something like that at the end, but listen to Wane Into It. It might change your lists for album of the year. So thanks for doing this, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I really
You're
appreciate
welcome.
it.